Hey keyboard nerds, I've had a lot of questions about recording Hammond organ in the studio and what is my setup. I've been recording Hammond organ tracks for about 30 years now, and when I started, in order to record a Hammond organ track you had to go to a recording studio, set up your Hammond, set up your Leslie, or sometimes they had them there, and we recorded to tape in these huge studios. Now, as you all know, the world has changed and many people are recording in basement home studios, just like this. And it's amazing the results that you can get recording with the simplest setup. Literally for very little money, you can deliver world-class tracks to anybody and turn them around in hours. It's really exciting. I feel like during the pandemic, I really had to dial my home recording setup in. I'd always been going to studios and I was really comfortable with that process. But during the pandemic, I learned how to record myself for the first time because I'd always worked with engineers. And now when somebody sends me a track to play on, I can turn it around in about 24 hours, send them beautifully recorded Hammond tracks, and they get used on albums. And so what I want to do today is I just want to show you my simple recording setup and show you hopefully that it is possible for you to do this as well. So I want to lift back the hood and show you how I do this. Here we go.
What Hammond and Leslie setup do you use on recordings?
On recordings, I use this Hammond B3. I believe it's a 1969 or a 1970. I've had it for over 30 years. And I run it with a Leslie 145. And I probably record on this every day when I'm not out on tour. I'll be sending out tracks from here on this organ. And she's a good old girl. She works good.
Do you notice a difference between the sound of this Hammond and other B3s outside of this studio?
Hammond B3s are interesting in the way that you could line up 10 of them and they would all sound completely different. They all have their own individual personality. Because of the way that they were made and they're hand wired and handmade, they're not a digital instrument. Because they each have a different voice, they all tend to sit slightly differently in a track. For me, this is not the most interesting, best sounding live organ, but when recording, it just fits right in the slot. It just fits right in the track and it just sits beautifully in a track. So I love recording on this organ. This organ probably feels really good to me to record with because I've been recording and playing on it for over 30 years. Sometimes when you go to a new studio and play on a new instrument, it takes a few minutes to acquaint yourself with the little quirks of that particular organ.
Have you done any modifications?
I have done one modification to this rig. People ask me this a lot. Is your rig stock? What have you done? Have you souped it up in any way? This organ is exactly as it was when it was bought from Hammond back in the day. There's really no modifications. It's completely stock. The one modification that I've done is actually to the Leslie 145. It's a modification that I would recommend if you're recording a lot. I've installed a solid state relay into the Leslie so that when I switch from slow to fast, it's completely silent. Interesting thing about Leslies is with the traditional relays in them, when you switch them, they give off a loud pop. And that's cool. And sometimes that sounds great in a track. But sometimes when you're playing really, really quiet, when that relay switches, it can be quite distracting in the track. So a lot of studios will do the mod where they'll replace the relay on the Leslie to a solid state just so that it's quieter, and that's what I've done. Other than that, it's completely stock.
What do you do for isolation?
Isolation is important, and I will say that when I started recording, I've done everything from hanging moving blankets in a square around the Leslie, which by the way works perfectly and is a great way to get started. I've also used office dividers and put them around the Leslie in a room. But in this particular studio, we've built a room inside a room isolation booth that the Leslie rolls inside. And this is great because I've got a booth where the mics are always sitting on the Leslie, it's always ready to record, and If you have a family, you can record at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can record whenever you want and nobody can hear it. Perfect.
What do you use for microphones?
When miking my Leslie, I use two Neumann TLM 102 microphones on the top. I hard pan them left and right to create the stereo field of the Leslie. These are Neumann's sort of most affordable large diaphragm microphone, and I love the way that they sound. On the bottom rotor of the Leslie, I use a Shure SM7, and I find it's a great microphone for the bottom because it's very, very focused and it doesn't pick up a lot of the air. It just focuses right in on the lower rotor and gives a really nice capture of that lower rotor. When I first got started recording, I would use Shure 57s in stereo on the top of the Leslie. It's probably the most affordable way that you can mic a Leslie. And always remember that they actually do a really beautiful capture of a Leslie. If you have a really good source sound, if your B3 sounds good and your Leslie sounds good, really any mics could work on it, but 57s are a really affordable option to put on the top.
Any tips on mic placement?
My tips on mic placement are, I typically mic my Leslie from the sides of the Leslie, not from the open baffles. When you're looking at the Leslie, you'll see the horns spinning. I don't mic it right on the horns because I try to avoid getting that wind noise off the horns. So I actually mic it on the wood sides of the Leslie, about 2 or 3 inches from each side. And same with the SM7 on the bottom. It's about 2 inches off the wood on the bottom, on the side. Nothing special. One thing that you have to consider when miking Leslies is that the horn speaker, so the horn driver, I guess they call it, in the top of the Leslie is offset to one side. So it's always a little louder on one side. One of the microphones will come in a little hotter than the other. So you either have to do an adjustment in how you place the microphones, or you can just do the adjustment on your computer. Just something to think about.
Should I be concerned about the mechanical noise of a Leslie?
One of the beautiful things about a Leslie is that it's a real rotary speaker that spins and has motors and belts, and there's clicking and there's whirring and there's all of those sounds. And frankly, I think that's part of the beauty of recording a real Hammond, is incorporating those sounds into the recording and hearing that it's the real thing and hearing the air and hearing the wind. I think that's part of what's special about it. So my advice is leave it in. I mean, obviously within reason. If there's some noise in the Leslie that needs to be fixed, fix it. But just the raw sound of a Leslie is beautiful. Keep it in your track.
Do you use a lot of EQ or record with a lot of effects?
I do not use a lot of EQ when I'm recording. I typically run my EQs or my preamps completely flat. I think the sound of the organ is perfect. I think it's beautiful, so I don't mess with it. I will run it through some 1073 Sims, preamp Sims in my Apollo, my Universal Audio Apollo, just to give it a little bit of warmth, and it's really nice, but I don't typically even touch the EQs. And about effects, there's nothing I love more than to play organ with reverb on it. But when I'm recording tracks, I always record it dry, and I always send it to the producer or whoever's asking for the track dry. If they want to add reverb, if they want to add effects to it, that's their decision, but I don't make that decision for them. I just send them the raw Hammond tracks.
How many takes do you send to a producer?
I will typically send 3 takes to a producer. What I find works is I'll send 2 takes that have parts, and when I say parts, I mean they might have a melody or a hook or a line off the top of the track. I might create some lines in, say, a verse 2 around a vocal, some little organ fills, and I'll send 2 of those type of tracks. One will be, I'll usually call it my keeper track, whichever one I think is the one that's going to work, but I'll always send an alternate so that the producer or engineer can comp together pieces of what they like about each track. But I'll always send a 3rd track, always, always. I'll send it what I call a pure pad track, where I just hold chords, switch the Leslie as simple as possible. 5 times out of 10, maybe more, producers will use that very simple track because Hammond organ is used very much as a glue in tracks. It's used as something to fill out tracks and is often not a feature. So 3 takes, 2 with parts, 1 pure pad track, and I find that works for me.
Is it everybody's method for how to do their setup and how to do their miking?
I think it's really important to remember, like a musician, always be creative. People ask me, what is my recording setup? This is my recording setup. It's probably very similar to the way that a lot of people mic Leslies and record Hammonds, but there's always different ways to do it, and I would encourage you to try different things. For instance, with the microphones that I pick, the reason why I've picked these microphones is because I've tried a whole bunch of different microphones in my career, and I kind of know the sound that I like. For instance, lots of people love to record Hammond with those Neumann pencil condensers on the top. I find that they're really harsh and thin sounding, but I love a Royer ribbon microphone because it's fat and smooth sounding, but sometimes that's too dark for a recording. So I find that the Neumann pencil microphones, which everybody uses, are too bright, and I find that the Royers are often too dark. So for me, this Neumann that I use, this TLM 102, is kind of right in the sweet spot, right in the middle. But that might not work for you. You might like the Neumann condensers, or you might like a ribbon, or you might like 57s. Try all of it, see what you prefer. Not everybody mics a Leslie with a stereo situation on the top. Some people do a mono situation on the top. Depends what you're looking for. That works too, and that's a very old school thing to do. And I've even seen producers do a stereo capture of the bottom rotor of the Leslie and a mono on the top, which is another thing that sounds really cool. So, you know, try everything. There's really no rules, and the cool thing about having your own space and having your own studio is that you have this time and this freedom to really experiment and figure out what works for you.
Right. Any final tips?
Another thing that I wanted to mention is I will always listen to a track and I'll go, is it a mellow track? Is it a really rock and roll track, a really aggressive track? And the one adjustment that I will always do is I'll walk into that booth and I'll adjust the volume on the Leslie. And that could be anywhere from 6 to as loud as it will go. And I'll always make that choice when I'm about to record a track, is where do I want to set the Leslie, because how do I want it to drive or distort in the track or not? So just some things to think about. There you go. What a cool world that we live in, where anybody can record from their basement studio at a world-class level. So just do it, is what I say. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.